October 1942, Sevastopol, Crimean Peninsula. The bloodiest siege of World War II. German infantryman Karl Weber crouched in a trench along the defensive perimeter, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands, trying to calm nerves that had been shredded by 6 months of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. He had survived the massive battles in Ukraine, had seen friends torn apart by Soviet artillery, had watched entire companies disappear into the meat grinder of urban warfare. But this position, this particular section of the Sevastopol defensive line, was different. Something was fundamentally wrong here. Something that violated every principle of modern warfare he had been taught. Men disappeared. Not in dramatic firefights with obvious casualties, not in artillery barrages or tank attacks or chaotic urban combat. They just vanished. A soldier would be standing guard in his position one moment, then there would be a distant crack of a rifle shot echoing across the ruins, and the soldier would be dead with a single bullet precisely through his head or heart. Surgical, clinical, deadly. Karl's unit had lost 12 men in the past week to this invisible enemy. Nobody saw the shooter. Nobody heard the approach. Nobody survived to describe their attacker. Just sudden death from impossible distances, delivered by someone who never missed, never revealed their position, never made mistakes. The veterans in his unit whispered a name. Lady Death. They said it was a Soviet sniper, a woman, the deadliest sharpshooter on the entire Eastern Front, a ghost who killed from shadows and vanished before anyone could respond. Karl thought they were exaggerating, creating a myth to explain combat losses, inventing a monster story to cope with the random violence of warfare. Women didn't fight. Women certainly didn't kill with the cold mechanical efficiency his comrades described. It was impossible. Propaganda. Fear making men irrational. He took another drag on his cigarette, exhaled smoke into the cold October air, prepared to resume his watch over the ruined landscape of Sevastopol. The bullet struck him precisely between the eyes before his brain could register the distant rifle crack. He was dead before his body hit the frozen ground, the cigarette still burning between his fingers, smoke rising into the grey morning sky. 800 yards away, concealed in the third floor of a bombed-out apartment building, Lyudmila Pavlichenko worked the bolt on her Mosin Nagant rifle with practiced efficiency. The empty cartridge case ejected and clinked onto the rubble-strewn floor. She chambered a fresh round, made a small precise mark in her worn leather notebook. Confirmed kill number 287. She scanned the German positions through her rifle scope, searching methodically for the next target. Her breathing was calm, her heartbeat steady, her hands absolutely still despite the freezing temperature. This was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, history student from Kyiv, champion competitive shooter, and the deadliest female sniper who ever lived. This is her story, not the sanitized propaganda version, not the Hollywood fiction, the real story. The true story of how a young woman became death itself. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko was born on July 12, 1916, in Bila Tserkva, a small town in central Ukraine. She entered a world on the verge of catastrophic change. The Russian Empire was collapsing. Revolution was coming. War, famine, social upheaval. The next 25 years would reshape not just Russia, but the entire world. Her family was working class, but not desperately poor. Her father worked in a factory. Her mother was a teacher. They valued education, hard work, disciplined traditional values that would survive the Bolshevik Revolution and become incorporated into Soviet ideology. Young Lyudmila was stubborn, fiercely competitive, and absolutely refused to lose at anything. Games with other children, academic competitions at school, arguments with adults. Every interaction was a contest, and Lyudmila intended to win every single one. Her parents found this exhausting. Her teachers found it problematic. Other children found her intimidating, but this personality trait, this refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances, would later save her life and make her legendary. When she was 14, her family moved to Kyiv, Ukraine's capital and one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. The move opened opportunities unavailable in small-town life. Better schools, cultural activities, sports programs, and crucially, shooting clubs. The Soviet Union actively promoted marksmanship as both sport and pre-military training. The government believed teaching young people to shoot would create a population ready to defend the socialist motherland if necessary. Shooting clubs operated throughout the country, offering free training, ammunition, and equipment. In 1930, at age 14, Lyudmila joined a local shooting club. She discovered immediately that she had exceptional natural talent. Her hand-eye coordination was remarkable. Her ability to control breathing, manage heartbeat, and squeeze triggers smoothly exceeded what instructors expected from any beginner, let alone a teenage girl. But her greatest advantage was psychological. Shooting competitions required absolute concentration, the ability to block out distractions, to remain calm under pressure, to execute perfect technique when it mattered most. Lyudmila's competitive nature and pathological hatred of losing gave her incredible mental discipline. She would rather die than miss a target, would rather suffer than admit defeat. This mindset made her nearly unbeatable in competition. By age 16, Lyudmila was competing in regional shooting championships. She often beat adult male competitors, which created controversy. Some men refused to compete against a teenage girl, claiming it was unfair or embarrassing, or somehow inappropriate. Lyudmila didn't care about their feelings. She wanted to shoot against the best marksmen, regardless of their age, gender, or wounded pride. She won consistently, dominating competitions, breaking records. By 18, she held multiple regional championships and several national records in various shooting disciplines. Shooting coaches recognized her as one of the most talented young marksmen in the Soviet Union. Not female marksmen, just marksmen. One of the best, competing successfully against anyone. This was unusual in 1930s Soviet Union. Despite official propaganda about socialist equality, Soviet society remained deeply patriarchal in practice. Women were expected to support the revolution through factory work, motherhood, and supportive roles. They were not expected to excel at traditionally male activities like competitive shooting. But Lyudmila kept winning, and winning made arguments about gender roles irrelevant. Her scores spoke for themselves. In 1937, Lyudmila enrolled at Kyiv University to study history. She was 21 years old, intellectually curious, politically engaged, and absolutely committed to building the Soviet future through education and civic participation. The Soviet education system emphasized creating well-rounded Soviet citizens, people who combined intellectual development with physical fitness and practical skills. Lyudmila embodied this ideal perfectly. She continued competitive shooting while pursuing her history degree, joined the University Rifle Club, trained regularly, competed in national championships. Shooting was no longer just a hobby. It was part of her identity, part of who she fundamentally was. Her academic work focused on Russian and Soviet military history. She studied famous battles, analyzed military tactics, examined the evolution of warfare from medieval armies to modern mechanized combat. She wrote papers on tactics, strategy, logistics, command structures. This academic background would prove surprisingly useful when she later applied those lessons on actual battlefields. Understanding military history helped her predict enemy behavior, recognize tactical patterns, exploit weaknesses in German formations. Lyudmila was also politically active. She joined the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, participated in political education programs, attended rallies, volunteered for community service projects. She was a true believer in Soviet ideology, convinced that socialism offered the best path to human progress and social justice. By 1941, at age 24, Lyudmila was completing her university studies with plans to become a history professor. She had a 4-year-old son from a brief early marriage that had ended in divorce. She lived with her parents, helped raise her son, studied hard, shot competitively on weekends. Her future seemed clear, comfortable, and entirely peaceful. Teaching, research, contributing to Soviet society through education rather than violence. Then, on June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Hitler's plan was simple: destroy the Soviet Union within 3 months, exterminate or enslave the Slavic population, colonize Eastern Europe for German settlement. Everything changed for Lyudmila, for the Soviet Union, for the entire world. June 23, 1941. One day after the German invasion began, Lyudmila walked into a military recruitment office in Kyiv. The office was absolute chaos. Hundreds of men crowded the space, trying to enlist, responding to Stalin's call for total mobilization. The Soviet Union needed millions of soldiers immediately to stop the German advance that was already overrunning Soviet defenses along the entire western border. Lyudmila pushed through the crowd to the recruitment desk. She told the officer she wanted to enlist, not as a nurse, not as a factory worker, not in any of the traditional female roles. She wanted to be a combat soldier, specifically a sniper. The recruitment officer, a middle-aged man overwhelmed by the chaos and pressure of processing thousands of enlistments, looked at this young woman and dismissed her request immediately, almost automatically, without even considering it seriously. Women didn't fight in combat roles. The Red Army had female nurses, support personnel, even some female pilots in specialized units. But infantry combat, frontline fighting, absolutely not. Too dangerous, physically demanding, psychologically destructive, inappropriate for women. The officer suggested she could serve her country better in a hospital, treating wounded soldiers, providing medical care, noble work, important work, women's work. Lyudmila refused to leave. She argued, she insisted. She wasn't going to be dismissed or redirected or told what was appropriate for her gender. She pulled out her shooting competition certificates, her medals, documentation of her marksmanship achievements. She showed them to the officer, explained she was one of the best marksmen in Ukraine, that she could outshoot most men in the room, that she had spent years training for exactly this kind of specialized combat role. The officer remained skeptical. Competition shooting and combat were completely different. Shooting paper targets at a nice range with judges watching was nothing like killing human beings under battlefield conditions. The psychological demands were incomparable. Most men couldn't handle it. A woman certainly couldn't. But the Soviet Union was desperate. The situation at the front was catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies were being surrounded and destroyed. The Wehrmacht was advancing so quickly that Soviet forces couldn't establish defensive lines. The Red Army needed every capable fighter, regardless of gender or conventional assumptions. The officer made a decision that would change military history. He accepted Lyudmila's enlistment and assigned her to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division as a sniper. If she proved incompetent or couldn't handle combat, they would reassign her to support roles. If she performed well, she could stay. Lyudmila was given a Mosin Nagant rifle with a 3.5 XPU scope, approximately 3 weeks of basic military training, and orders to report to her unit defending Odessa, a major port city on the Black Sea that German and Romanian forces were preparing to attack. 3 weeks later, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was on the front lines of the most brutal war in human history, about to kill her first human being. August 1941. Outskirts of Odessa. The siege had just begun. Lyudmila lay concealed in a bombed-out building, watching German positions through her rifle scope. She had been in position for 6 hours, barely moving, controlling her breathing, managing her bladder, watching and waiting for a target to present itself. Combat sniping was nothing like competition shooting. There were no nice weather conditions, no comfortable shooting benches, no judges ensuring fairness, no rules preventing someone from shooting back at you. Just mud, fear, exhaustion, constant artillery fire, and the ever-present possibility of death from 1,000 different sources. Lyudmila had not yet fired her rifle in combat. She had observed enemy positions, learned from experienced snipers, studied how veteran marksmen operated, listened to their advice, practiced camouflage and concealment. But she had not yet crossed the fundamental line between target shooting and killing. Through her scope, she watched a German officer emerge from a command post approximately 400 meters away. He stood in an exposed position, apparently directing troops, studying a map, completely vulnerable to anyone with clear sight and accurate rifle. Range approximately 400 meters. Wind from the left at about 5 miles per hour. Slight uphill angle requiring trajectory adjustment. She calculated the necessary corrections instinctively, her years of competition experience translating directly to combat mathematics. She settled the crosshairs on the German officer's chest. His heart, center mass, the most reliable kill shot, controlled her breathing inhale, exhale halfway, hold. Slowed her heartbeat through force of will and discipline. Applied smooth, steady pressure to the trigger. No jerking, no anticipation, just gradual increasing pressure until the weapon fired. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the crack of the shot echoed across the battlefield. Through the scope, she saw the German officer collapse. Her first kill, a human being dead by her hand. Not a paper target, not an abstraction, not a training exercise. A person who moments ago was alive, thinking, feeling, existing, and now was not. Because Lyudmila Pavlichenko had decided he should die and possessed the skill to make it happen. She expected to feel something. Horror at taking a life, guilt over killing another human being, remorse or moral anguish or the psychological trauma that instructors had warned about. She felt nothing except professional satisfaction. The shot had been accurate, the target eliminated, mission accomplished. No different from hitting a bullseye at competition, except the target was flesh instead of paper. Later, she would recognize this emotional numbness as both her greatest strength and her deepest wound. The ability to kill without emotional reaction made her an exceptionally effective sniper. She could kill repeatedly, mechanically, without psychological interference. But it also damaged something fundamental in her humanity. Created psychological scars that would never fully heal. Disconnected her from normal human emotional responses in ways that would haunt her for the rest of her life. For now, though, she just loaded another round and searched for her next target. She was a soldier doing a job. Killing was her function, not something to celebrate or regret, just something to do competently and repeatedly until the war ended. The Battle of Odessa lasted from August 5 to October 16, 1941. Romanian forces, supported by German units, attempted to capture this strategically important port city. Soviet forces, outnumbered and outgunned, defended desperately. The fighting was brutal, urban combat mixed with trench warfare. Every building was a fortress, every street was a killing ground. Artillery rained down constantly, casualties mounted horrifically on both sides. Lyudmila fought throughout the entire siege. She learned combat sniping through experience, through nearly dying, through watching soldiers beside her get killed, through 2 months of continuous exposure to violence and death. She learned which positions offered the best fields of fire, how to predict enemy movement patterns, how to identify officers and specialists whose deaths would most disrupt enemy operations, how to move between positions without being seen, how to stay hidden for 12 hours without moving even when her body screamed for relief. She killed methodically, professionally, without emotion or hesitation. German soldiers, Romanian soldiers, anyone wearing an enemy uniform who entered her kill zone died. 1 shot, 1 kill. Rarely 2 shots because that revealed your position and invited counter-sniper fire or artillery. Her daily kill count varied, sometimes 0 if enemy activity was minimal, sometimes 5 or 6 if German forces launched attacks that exposed personnel. She kept meticulous records in her notebook, documenting every confirmed kill with date, time, range, conditions, and witness verification. Soviet regulations required confirmation for each kill. You couldn't just claim kills without evidence. A witness had to verify the shot and the target's death. Or you needed documentary evidence, like captured identification from the body. Lyudmila was meticulous about confirmation. Every kill in her notebook was genuine, verified, and accurate. Her battalion commander began noticing unusual casualty patterns in sectors where Lyudmila operated. Enemy losses were consistently high. Officer casualties were disproportionate. Machine gun positions went silent with suspicious regularity. He checked her confirmed kill records. After 2 months in Odessa, Lyudmila had 187 confirmed kills. 187 enemy soldiers killed in 8 weeks. More than most snipers achieved in entire military careers. An extraordinary, almost unbelievable number. But Soviet military intelligence verified every single kill through the documentation system. The commander realized he had discovered something exceptional. This young woman was not just a competent sniper, she was devastating. Possibly the most effective sniper in the entire Red Army. He arranged for Lyudmila to receive advanced sniper training during brief rest periods. Better equipment. Assignment to critical sectors where her skills could have maximum impact. Recognition as an elite soldier deserving special support. In early October 1941, Soviet High Command ordered the evacuation of Odessa. The city couldn't be held against overwhelming enemy forces. Defenders withdrew by sea to Sevastopol in Crimea, where they would make another desperate stand. Lyudmila evacuated with her unit. She had survived Odessa with minor wounds, shrapnel cuts, a bullet graze that barely broke skin, injuries so insignificant they didn't even merit medical evacuation. She arrived in Sevastopol with 187 confirmed kills, a growing reputation, and a new name that would become legendary, Lady Death. Soviet propaganda had begun featuring her in news reports, articles about heroic defenders, stories designed to boost civilian morale. Lyudmila found the attention uncomfortable but understood its importance to the war effort. So she cooperated with journalists, gave interviews, allowed photographers to document her work. The propaganda would later save her life in ways she couldn't anticipate. The siege of Sevastopol began in October 1941 and lasted until July 1942. 9 months of continuous combat, the longest and bloodiest siege of World War II. A nightmare of artillery, air raids, urban warfare, and human suffering on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The siege became legendary for its violence and destruction. German forces employed massive siege artillery, including the largest guns ever built, railway-mounted cannons firing shells weighing 7 tons that could demolish entire buildings with single shots. The Luftwaffe conducted constant bombing raids. Infantry assaults came daily, sometimes hourly. Soviet defenders held despite catastrophic casualties. They transformed every building into a fortress, every street into a killing zone, every block into a battleground. The city was gradually pulverized, reduced to rubble and ruins. But Soviet soldiers continued fighting from the wreckage. Sevastopol was hell on earth, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko thrived in it. Urban warfare favored snipers, endless hiding positions, multiple firing lanes, confused, chaotic battle space where a single accurate shot could change engagement outcomes. Buildings provided concealment and protection, ruins created natural camouflage. The destruction itself became tactical advantage for patient, skilled marksmen. Lyudmila established a routine: wake before dawn, move to her hide position while darkness provided concealment. Remain motionless throughout the day, watching German positions through her scope, waiting for targets. When Germans advanced or exposed themselves, she killed. Officers first, disrupting command and control, then specialists, machine gunners, mortar crews, radio operators, then any other enemy soldiers who presented clear shots. Her kill rate increased dramatically. The ruins of Sevastopol provided endless advantageous positions. German forces were forced to advance through open areas to assault Soviet positions. Every advance created opportunities for her rifle. She killed 2 to 5 enemy soldiers per day on average. Some days more if German forces launched major attacks. Some days fewer if weather prevented operations. But she killed constantly, mechanically, without emotion or hesitation. She kept detailed records in her notebook. Every kill logged with date, time, estimated range, weather conditions, target description. The notebook became a grim accounting ledger, a record of death delivered with precision and efficiency. By December 1941, she had 257 confirmed kills. By February 1942, 287 kills. By May 1942, 309 kills. 309 confirmed enemy soldiers killed in less than a year of combat. An extraordinary number that Soviet and later Western military analysts verified through extensive documentation. The Germans became obsessed with killing her. German military intelligence knew Lady Death was real. Not Soviet propaganda, not exaggeration. A genuine threat causing significant casualties. Their reports showed patterns, specific sectors where officer deaths were disproportionately high, consistent with a single highly skilled sniper operating repeatedly in the same general areas but never using the same position twice. German counter-sniper units were deployed specifically to hunt Lyudmila. Elite marksmen with dozens of kills themselves, trained specifically to eliminate enemy snipers. They studied her patterns, tried to predict her positions, set elaborate traps to draw her into kill zones. They failed repeatedly. Lyudmila was too careful, too disciplined, too experienced. She never used the same position twice, never established predictable patterns, never took unnecessary risks. She varied her schedule, her routes, her techniques. When she suspected counter-snipers were hunting her specifically, she disappeared, shifted to different sectors, changed her entire operational approach. The Germans tried propaganda. Leaflets dropped over Soviet lines offered rewards for information leading to her death or capture. Specific amounts, first hundreds, then thousands of Reichsmarks. Radio broadcasts described her as a murderer, a criminal, a disgrace to womanhood, an abomination. They hoped to demoralize her, anger her, make her careless. She ignored it all completely. Words couldn't hurt her, only bullets mattered, and German bullets kept missing while hers never did. German commanders discussed using artillery saturation of entire city blocks she might be hiding in. Chemical weapons. Anything to eliminate this one soldier who was killing their men with such efficiency. Before they could implement extreme measures, they decided to send their absolute best sniper. A counter-sniper specialist with over 40 confirmed kills. A veteran hunter who had eliminated numerous Soviet snipers already. He would find Lady Death and kill her. May 1942. The duel began. For 3 days, 2 of the war's most skilled snipers hunted each other through the ruins of Sevastopol. Both knew the other was hunting them. Both understood this was not routine combat, but personal professional competition. Hunter versus hunter. The German sniper was experienced and careful. He chose positions wisely, moved cautiously, searched methodically for any sign of his quarry. He knew Lady Death was somewhere in this sector. He just had to find her before she found him. Lyudmila knew a counter-sniper was hunting her specifically. Her instincts and experience told her this enemy was different. More skilled, more dangerous. Not routine German infantry, but a professional killer like herself. For 2 days, neither spotted the other. Both remained hidden. Both watched and waited with infinite patience. On the 3rd day, the German made a tiny mistake. He moved positions during daylight. He had chosen a route he thought was completely concealed from Soviet observation. Hidden by rubble, walls, destroyed buildings. Safe. It wasn't safe. Lyudmila spotted a brief glimpse of movement. Perhaps 2 seconds. Just enough to identify the general location, not enough to take a shot, but enough to know approximately where her hunter was hiding. She didn't react immediately, didn't fire. That would reveal her position without confirming a kill. Instead, she waited, watched, studied the area where the German had disappeared. She waited for 6 hours, completely motionless, barely breathing, absolutely focused. The German eventually made another small mistake. He adjusted his rifle scope, a movement so slight most observers would miss it completely. The tiniest shift of position, the briefest flash of reflected light from his scope lens. Lyudmila saw it, identified his exact position, the small opening where his scope protruded from concealment. She aimed carefully, took her time, one shot through that tiny opening, through the gap in the rubble, across approximately 600 yards, under difficult conditions with wind and variable light. She fired. The bullet struck the German scope dead center, shattered the optical glass, drove fragments into the German sniper's right eye and brain. Instant death. Confirmed kill number 291, the elimination of Germany's best counter-sniper in the Sevastopol sector. Later, when Soviet forces recovered the body, they confirmed the dead sniper's identity. A highly decorated German marksman. Over 40 confirmed kills, multiple awards, one of Germany's elite hunters. Dead with an arrow. No, a bullet through his scope. Killed by the woman he had been sent to eliminate. The story spread through both Soviet and German lines. Lyudmila's reputation grew to almost mythical proportions. The Germans feared her more than ever. Soviet morale soared. But German commanders realized they couldn't kill her through conventional means. She was too good, too careful, too experienced. They would need to either accept ongoing casualties or change tactics completely. Before they could implement new strategies, Soviet High Command made a decision that saved Lyudmila's life. They evacuated her from Sevastopol. June 1942. Soviet military intelligence informed Red Army leadership that Germany was preparing a massive final assault on Sevastopol. Overwhelming forces, giant siege guns. Every available unit committed to capturing the city. The city would fall. Everyone understood this. Soviet forces were exhausted, depleted, running critically low on ammunition and supplies. Continued defense was heroic, but ultimately futile. Sevastopol would be captured within weeks. Soviet leadership decided to evacuate their most valuable personnel before the final collapse. Key commanders who could lead new units. Experienced officers who could train replacement troops. Specialists whose skills and knowledge justified the risk of evacuation. And Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Lyudmila didn't want to leave. She argued that her duty was fighting, not evacuating while comrades remained in danger. Her place was on the front line, killing Germans, not safe in the rear. Her commander explained that she was more valuable alive than dead. Her combat experience could train hundreds of new snipers. Her propaganda value could boost morale across the entire Soviet Union. Her death at Sevastopol would accomplish nothing except eliminating one highly skilled soldier. Orders were absolute and not subject to debate. Lyudmila was evacuated by submarine in late June 1942, just days before Sevastopol's final fall. She was one of the last Soviet personnel to escape before German forces overran the city. She arrived in Moscow with 309 confirmed kills, minor wounds from shrapnel fragments, severe exhaustion from 9 months of continuous combat, and complicated feelings about leaving while others stayed to fight and die. The Soviet propaganda machine immediately seized on her story. She became a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor, a symbol of resistance and determination, proof that even women could fight and kill for the motherland. Her photograph appeared in newspapers, magazines, posters everywhere. Artists painted her portrait. Poets wrote verses celebrating her courage and skill. Lyudmila hated the attention but understood its necessity. The Soviet Union was losing badly in 1942. German forces were advancing towards Stalingrad, threatening to cut the country in half. Civilian morale was collapsing under the strain of catastrophic losses and brutal occupation. The government desperately needed heroes, inspiring stories, evidence that resistance was possible and worthwhile. She gave speeches to factory workers and military units, granted interviews to journalists, posed for photographers, pretended to be comfortable with celebrity when she desperately wanted to return to her unit, to continue fighting, to be a soldier instead of a propaganda symbol. In August 1942, Soviet leadership made an even more unusual decision. They sent Lyudmila on an international propaganda tour to Britain and the United States to build support for increased Allied aid to the Soviet Union. A Soviet combat soldier visiting capitalist countries. Unthinkable in normal times. But these were not normal times. September 1942, Lyudmila arrived in Britain. She was the first Soviet citizen to visit since Germany attacked the USSR. Britain was fascinated and confused. A female soldier, a woman who personally killed hundreds of men. This contradicted everything British society believed about gender roles, warfare, and appropriate behavior for women. British reporters asked offensive questions. Did she wear makeup during combat? How did killing affect her feminine nature? Could she still be a good mother after becoming a killer? Was she attractive to men despite her violent profession? Lyudmila was disgusted but remained polite. She needed British support for the Soviet Union, so she tolerated the sexism and cultural ignorance. One British newspaper headline read, "Girl sniper kills 309 and still looks feminine." The accompanying article spent more time discussing her appearance than her combat record, analyzing her hair, her smile, whether she wore makeup, whether men found her attractive. The entire British media experience reduced her combat achievements to secondary curiosities beneath the supposedly more interesting question of whether a female killer could still be feminine. In October 1942, she traveled to the United States for a more extensive tour. American media was even worse. She met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House. The meeting was cordial, and Eleanor Roosevelt showed genuine interest in Lyudmila's experiences. But American reporters at the press conference that followed were obsessed with triviality. They asked if she wore lipstick in combat, whether German soldiers found her attractive, if killing was unwomanly, whether her combat service made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. One journalist suggested that 309 kills was obviously Soviet propaganda, that no woman could possibly kill that many men, that the story must be exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Lyudmila's patience wore thin. At a press conference in Chicago, a reporter asked for the third time why she didn't wear makeup. Lyudmila responded sharply, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The room fell silent. Some reporters were offended. Others recognized they deserved the rebuke. All of them realized this was not a woman who would tolerate being trivialized or sexualized while they asked stupid questions about lipstick. The response was controversial. Some Americans found it refreshing. Finally, someone was being honest instead of diplomatic. Others found it rude, unfeminine, inappropriate for a foreign guest. But everyone agreed Lyudmila Pavlichenko was remarkable, even if they couldn't quite understand or accept what she represented. Eleanor Roosevelt took a personal interest in Lyudmila. The First Lady recognized that this young woman had experienced horrors beyond American comprehension, that she carried trauma no victory parade could heal. Eleanor invited Lyudmila to stay at the White House. They spent hours talking privately. Eleanor was one of the few people who didn't judge, didn't sexualize, didn't treat Lyudmila like a curiosity or propaganda symbol. She treated her like a person who had survived hell and deserved respect and compassion. The two women formed an unexpected bond that would last until Eleanor's death 20 years later. November 1942, Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union after her propaganda tours. She hoped to return to combat, to rejoin her unit, to continue fighting. Soviet military leadership absolutely refused. Her combat days were over. She was too valuable as a symbol, too important to Soviet propaganda efforts, too famous to risk losing in combat. Her death would be a propaganda disaster. She would serve her country in other ways. They assigned her to train snipers. She spent the rest of the war teaching new recruits, passing on her techniques, her tactical knowledge, her survival skills. She trained hundreds of snipers who would go on to fight on the Eastern Front. She hated teaching. She wanted to fight, not talk about fighting. But she obeyed orders, taught effectively, turned civilians into soldiers who later killed thousands of enemy troops. She also completed her interrupted university studies. In 1943, she earned her history degree through correspondence courses. In 1944, she began a master's degree program, continuing her academic career alongside military training duties. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lyudmila had not fired her rifle in combat for 3 years. The war ended with her far from any battlefield, teaching rather than fighting, famous but deeply frustrated. The war was over. The Soviet Union had survived, had defeated Nazi Germany at catastrophic cost. 27 million Soviet citizens died. Cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. But the socialist motherland endured. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was 29 years old, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union, one of the most famous women in the country. She had everything: fame, respect, a guaranteed comfortable life, opportunities most Soviet citizens could only dream about. She was also profoundly damaged. 3 years of combat killing 309 human beings had broken something essential in her psychological makeup. The ability to kill without emotional reaction wasn't a superpower. It was trauma, dissociation, a survival mechanism that prevented normal emotional processing. That mechanism had kept her alive during the war. After the war, it destroyed her ability to function normally. Lyudmila struggled to connect emotionally with other people. She had nightmares constantly. Not about her victims, interestingly. She rarely thought about the 309 Germans she killed. They were targets, eliminated threats, not people she felt guilty about. Her nightmares were about being hunted, about German counter-snipers finally finding her. about dying alone in ruins while her body slowly went cold, about being too slow, making a mistake, failing at the only thing she was good at. She self-medicated with alcohol. Soviet society had a complicated relationship with alcoholism. Heavy drinking was common, even celebrated in some contexts. But for women, especially famous women, public drunkenness was scandalous. Lyudmila tried to hide her drinking, tried to maintain her public image while privately collapsing under psychological weight she couldn't bear. She completed her master's degree in 1945, then began a PhD program. She became Dr. Lyudmila Pavlichenko in 1949, earning her doctorate in history. She became a professor at Kyiv University, teaching Soviet military history. Teaching helped somewhat. Academic work required focus, discipline, intellectual engagement qualities Lyudmila possessed abundantly. She was reportedly an excellent professor, demanding but fair, bringing real combat experience to discussions of military tactics. But she was also isolated, lonely, unable to form close relationships. Most people couldn't relate to her experiences. Civilians found her intimidating or strange. They didn't understand combat, couldn't comprehend what she had seen and done. Conversations felt impossible. How do you explain killing 309 people to someone who had never experienced violence? Veterans understood combat trauma, but many were uncomfortable around her. A woman who killed more enemy soldiers than most men challenged traditional assumptions about gender and warfare. Some respected her achievements, others resented her fame or found her presence unsettling. She married twice after the war. Both marriages were troubled, marked by her emotional unavailability, her nightmares, her drinking, her inability to connect emotionally. Both ended in divorce. She maintained relationships with her son, who had been raised primarily by her parents during and after the war. But those relationships were complicated by her long absences, her emotional distance, her inability to discuss the parts of her life that mattered most. Despite personal struggles, Lyudmila remained valuable to Soviet propaganda throughout the Cold War. She appeared in documentary films, granted interviews to journalists, attended veterans' events, served as a symbol of Soviet military prowess and socialist gender equality. The Soviet Union promoted her story as proof that communism liberated women, allowed them to achieve greatness in fields traditionally dominated by men. She was presented as evidence of socialist superiority over capitalist societies that limited women to domestic roles. This narrative was partially true. The Soviet Union did provide opportunities for women that many Western countries did not. Soviet women worked in heavy industry, earned university degrees, pursued careers in fields closed to women elsewhere. But the narrative also obscured reality. Most Soviet women didn't want to be combat soldiers. They were mobilized by desperate wartime need, not by enlightened gender equality policies. After the war, Soviet society quickly pushed women back toward traditional roles, emphasizing motherhood and domestic labor. Lyudmila was exceptional, not representative. Her success didn't mean Soviet women generally had equal opportunities. She was a propaganda symbol whose reality was far more complicated than official narratives suggested. International interest continued throughout the Cold War. Western journalists periodically interviewed her. Filmmakers approached her about biographical movies. Authors wanted to write her story. She cooperated selectively, sometimes granting access, sometimes refusing, never quite comfortable with her legendary status. In 1957, she wrote her memoir, published in Russian as Combat Path of a Soviet Sniper. The book described her wartime experiences in detail, her training, her combat techniques, her thoughts about killing and survival. It was surprisingly honest about the psychological costs of combat, though constrained by Soviet censorship requirements that prevented complete candor about trauma and suffering. The memoir was translated into multiple languages, became required reading in Soviet military academies, inspired generations of female soldiers worldwide. In 1957, Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Soviet Union as part of a cultural exchange program during a brief thaw in Cold War tensions. She specifically requested to meet Lyudmila Pavlichenko, her friend from the 1942 propaganda tour. The reunion was emotional for both women. 15 years had passed, both had aged, changed, experienced losses and triumphs. Eleanor's husband Franklin had died in 1945. Eleanor had devoted herself to humanitarian work through the United Nations, advocating for human rights and peace. They spent an afternoon together in Moscow, talking privately, catching up on their lives, reconnecting across the Cold War divide. Lyudmila confided her struggles: the alcoholism, the failed marriages, the loneliness and isolation, the difficulty of adjusting to peacetime when war was the only thing she had ever been good at. Eleanor listened without judgment, offered support and understanding, reminded Lyudmila that surviving trauma was not weakness, but profound strength, that she had given everything for her country's survival, that she deserved peace and self-forgiveness. Eleanor also struggled with personal losses and political disappointments: her husband's death, the rise of Cold War tensions, the slow progress on human rights issues she cared deeply about. She understood trauma, grief, the difficulty of finding meaning after surviving terrible events. The two women maintained correspondence after the reunion, exchanged letters until Eleanor's death in 1962. These letters, later published, reveal Lyudmila's inner struggles more honestly than any public statement. She wrote about nightmares, guilt over surviving when so many comrades died, the impossibility of explaining combat to people who never experienced it, the feeling that she had become something inhuman during the war and could never fully return to being normal. Eleanor's responses were compassionate, wise, emphasizing that Lyudmila had saved countless Soviet lives through her 309 kills, that she deserved peace, that she should forgive herself for doing what was necessary to stop fascism. Lyudmila kept Eleanor's letters for the rest of her life, treasured them as evidence that someone understood, someone cared, someone saw her as human rather than as symbol or legend or monster. The 1960s and 1970s saw Lyudmila slowly finding some measure of peace. She continued teaching at Kyiv University, reduced her public appearances, spent more time with her son and grandchildren, never stopped drinking completely, but managed it better, functioned adequately despite ongoing psychological struggles. She remained active in veterans' organizations, mentored younger soldiers, advocated for better treatment of combat veterans, particularly those suffering from psychological trauma. Soviet society was terrible at addressing mental health issues. Veterans were expected to be strong, stoic, unbreakable. Admitting psychological struggles was seen as weakness. There was no treatment, no support, no acknowledgement that combat could cause permanent damage. Lyudmila pushed back against this attitude. She spoke publicly about her nightmares, her difficulty adjusting to civilian life, the permanent psychological scars combat inflicted. This honesty was unusual, even radical. It helped other veterans feel less alone, less ashamed of their own struggles. In 1973, Soviet authorities invited Lyudmila to visit Sevastopol for the first time since her 1942 evacuation. The city had been completely rebuilt, transformed from ruins into a modern Soviet city, but traces of the battle remained. Bullet holes in buildings, memorials to fallen defenders, museums documenting the siege. Walking through Sevastopol was emotionally devastating for Lyudmila. She recognized streets where she had killed German soldiers, buildings where she had hidden, positions where she had nearly died. The memories were overwhelming, sharp and clear despite 31 years having passed. She visited monuments dedicated to Sevastopol's defenders, saw her own name listed among heroes of the Soviet Union, attended ceremonies honoring veterans, gave speeches to young students about defending the motherland. But privately, she told family members that returning to Sevastopol was a mistake. The past should stay buried. Remembering served no useful purpose except causing pain. She never returned to Sevastopol again. October 10, 1974. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in Moscow at age 58. The official cause was stroke, but decades of heavy drinking, chronic stress, and untreated PTSD had certainly contributed to her early death. Her funeral was a state affair. Thousands attended: military honor guards, government officials, veterans from her unit, students she had taught, journalists documenting the passing of a legend. She was buried in Moscow's WWII cemetery, the prestigious cemetery where Soviet heroes, artists, and leaders are interred. Her grave features a marble statue of her in military uniform, rifle in hand, gazing towards some distant horizon. The inscription is simple: Lyudmila Pavlichenko, hero of the Soviet Union, 1916-1974. It doesn't mention 309 kills, doesn't quantify her contribution in enemy deaths, just acknowledges she was a hero, which somehow seems more appropriate than listing statistics. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today, decades after her death. Can women kill as effectively as men? Lyudmila proved the answer is yes. Absolutely, without question. Physical strength advantages men possess in hand-to-hand combat become irrelevant when the weapon is a rifle fired from concealed positions at long range. Should women serve in combat roles? Lyudmila would answer that capable individuals should serve according to their abilities, regardless of gender. If your country needs defenders and you possess the skills to defend it, you should fight. Does killing damage women differently than men? Lyudmila's PTSD and alcoholism suggest combat trauma is not gendered. Men and women both suffer psychological wounds from war, but society remains deeply uncomfortable with female violence. Male soldiers who kill are heroes. Female soldiers who kill are aberrations, somehow unnatural, even when performing identical actions. This double standard reflects cultural assumptions about femininity, rather than anything inherent to women themselves. Lyudmila paid a tremendous price for her 309 kills. She saved countless Soviet lives. Her marksmanship disrupted German operations. Her propaganda value boosted civilian morale. Her training improved Red Army sniper effectiveness. She contributed significantly to Soviet victory. But she also destroyed something fundamental in herself. The ability to kill 309 human beings without emotional reaction wasn't strength. It was psychological damage. Disconnection from normal human emotional responses. Trauma that manifested as nightmares, alcoholism, inability to form close relationships, early death at 58. Would Lyudmila have been better off never becoming a sniper? Impossible to say. She believed her service was necessary, that her 309 kills saved Soviet lives, that she had fulfilled her duty. But she paid for those 309 kills with her mental health, her happiness, and ultimately her life. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died nearly 50 years ago. But her story remains relevant. She proved women could fight as effectively as men in elite combat roles. This should have revolutionized military thinking. Instead, most countries maintained restrictions on female combat personnel for decades, ignoring evidence. Even today, debates continue despite overwhelming evidence that properly trained women perform successfully in combat roles. She also demonstrated the universal costs of combat. Men and women both suffer PTSD. Both need psychological support that societies often fail to provide. Her legacy challenges both traditional gender assumptions and idealized narratives about war heroism. She was not a simple hero. She was a complex, damaged person who performed extraordinary actions and paid extraordinary prices. We honor her by telling her complete story. The 309 kills and the nightmares, the fame and the isolation, the military effectiveness and the psychological costs. She deserves to be remembered as she actually was, not as propaganda symbol or simplified narrative. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, history student, champion marksman, Soviet sniper, Lady Death, hero of the Soviet Union, combat veteran, professor, mother, grandmother, alcoholic, legend. All of these simultaneously, all true, all part of her story. She killed 309 enemy soldiers in defense of her country. She survived combat that killed millions. She lived 30 more years carrying trauma that never healed. Remember her, learn from her, honor both her courage and her cost.